Writer's House. It's so good to actually be in person inside. I mean, it's weird. I mean, I know we're doing that, but it's still, every time I think about it and talk about it, it feels new, and I'm glad we're doing it. This program tonight is hosted by the illustrious Anthony DeCurtis. It's part of the RealArts at Penn programming, which is also sponsored by Creative Ventures. Creative Ventures is all about innovation and entrepreneurial creativity, thinking outside the box, interdisciplinary work. Through Creative Ventures, we are able to do a lot of sort of next to writing projects, and then writing projects also. But so before Anthony introduces Rachel, I wanted to take a moment just to introduce Anthony. Semester by semester, year after year, Anthony DeCurtis helps put the Writers House community in touch with people who kind of fall into those categories I described, people who are doing really interesting work, extraordinary work, fascinating work. It's through Anthony that we meet film critics and musicians and filmmakers and culture writers and fashion critics and people who are kind of doing the real work of arts in the world, arts within the structures we live within. So one main idea here is that it's important to integrate real world creative practice with the life of the university, and Anthony he helps us do that. So if you haven't had a chance to take a class with Anthony DeCurtis, you should. Some of the visitors who come through the RealArts program and through Creative Ventures only come to the class. It's like a secret, I think. There's plenty of time for you to actually get to meet people in the class. Anthony is a Grammy winner, a longtime contributing editor at Rolling Stone, and a distinguished lecturer here at Penn. So I'm really so happy Anthony's here, and that he brings us amazing people like Rachel Tashjian. Yes. It's a really cool project. And so please help me welcome both of these folks for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for that very, very kind and generous introduction. I couldn't be happier than to have Rachel here. Rachel is a former student. As John Kennedy once said, success has 1,000 fathers and failure is an orphan. I regard myself, and we'll be claiming Rachel as she continues to skyrocket in her renown in the years to come. And there is a quality to Rachel's writing that I'm so excited that people are responding to it the way they are. Most recently, Rachel just took a job as fashion news editor at Harper's Bazaar. She previously was the fashion critic at GQ. And she's also, got her Opulent Tips invitation-only newsletter. And but Rachel is always somebody who, without making a lot of kind of contrivance or pretense about it, just kind of naturally thinks creatively, thinks innovatively, sees things freshly. She's not somebody that, she thinks for herself, I suppose is what I'm trying to say, and she writes that way too. She just did a session, I'm teaching a David Bowie class this semester, and Rachel came in to talk about David Bowie and style, and it was sensational. We had a great conversation, and she really deepened what we're doing. So, Rachel, thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, no. Well, one thing that you said about the class was that you were really kind of struck by people's kind of being conversant in fashion and style, more so seemingly than when you were than when you were a student here. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, and talk about maybe what you think has changed and why that might be.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I remember when I had first graduated, I guess, from college, and, I graduated in 2011. So politics were like just becoming contentious again. And, there was this sort of feeling among a lot of fashion writers and also among just sort of cultural critics that like you weren't supposed to talk about what politicians were wearing, that was considered somehow condescending or disrespectful. And I thought that's pretty, to me, that just always seemed really unusual because so much of politics is about crafting an image and selling that image to people. And one of the things I was really interested in, as I became more and more curious about fashion writing was like, how can you approach it from directions that aren't necessarily, this happened on the runway, because that doesn't really like mean anything to anyone. I think that's just sort of like the starting point of a conversation about a garment's sort of life in the world. And I think sort of like two things happened that made all of us into fashion experts in a way, or fashion critics. One of which is just this like explosion in celebrity style and the relationships that celebrities have to the fashion industry. There's always been this relationship between celebrity and fashion. Armani did the costumes for American Gigolo, which was made in 1980 or 81. So that's it's like a long-term thing. But I think, if you think about maybe someone like Lupita Nyong'o and her Oscar campaign in 2014, at that point, she was this like unheard of actress. And she hired this really creative stylist, Michaela Erlinger, who was putting her in these really unusual, like almost like intellectual, very special clothes. And I think that helped sort of explain to the world who this person was. And I think after that, more sort of actors started to realize, wait a minute, like this can be a really important part of my career. I think many of them have also realized like this can make me some extra money. And I think in addition to that, again, there's always been this relationship between musicians and fashion, as you probably know even better than I do. But again, I think fashion houses sort of realize like, wait a minute, these musicians have an understanding of what we're making that's like more interesting and profound maybe than we might have realized. I think in some cases it was trying to make up for some wrongdoings in the 90s and sort of like ignoring certain customer segments and like, that sort of thing. But just realizing like, oh, this could be a really powerful vector to like take our clothing to show our clothing to the world. And so I think seeing this sort of more editorial, like high concept clothing in public, and the way that sort of Instagram has made that compelling and sort of propelled it to this huge audience, I think that's kind of what it is. I mean, the other thing, unfortunately, we have to say is that like Donald Trump was so like he had such an aesthetic that it was impossible to not talk about that. Like no one ever cared so much about the way that they looked as him, probably.
Well, I mean, I felt like that was kind of often an overlooked element of, just if you just think of the MAGA cap as a fashion thing.
Yeah.
Like it kind of, well, maybe I should turn that over to you. But I mean, I think, like in a sense, I mean, look, I find every aspect of it revolting. But, if you were to design something to make a certain kind of point, it just seemed perfect in a certain way. I mean, I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah.
I mean, I know we just wandered into it.
No, but it is interesting that he launched his campaign with that hat. I mean, that was really, and he had this kind of slogan that, the Make America Great Again slogan, it like doesn't mean really anything. It's just sort of like vague nostalgia.
No, like it's the kind of slogan that if you presented it to somebody who was kind of like too smart, they would say, oh, that's, what are you really saying? Like there's nothing there. But like it was so gripping, to people, like, and, MAGA hats and, like just that idea. I mean, in a certain kind of strategic way. It was brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there is such a fascinating relationship that developed between the, the right and the sort of Trump supporters and fashion. I mean, if you look at the January 6th, insurrection, riot, essentially, like everyone was wearing costumes. It was really crazy. And these, clearly this is sort of a group of people who think that, or who understand that what they wear communicates like what they're about.
Fascinating. Talk a little bit about, how this kind of evolving nature of what fashion is and how fashion is perceived, how has that affected your writing and what you like to write about? Like, has it, I don't know. I mean, you probably should talk a little bit about maybe how your thinking has also evolved, but, talk about your writing and how it's affected that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, the thing that I was really obsessed with, like, if thinking of like 3 or 4 years ago, was, as I said, like approaching fashion from any angle that wasn't like a runway review. So like trying to find any way in that where I saw like a fashion moment happening that like wasn't something that a designer created and showed on a runway. And it was actually really interesting that I had this thought. I mean, it was like kind of a perfect thing that I sort of started to approach things at that time, because this was also around the time that the designer Virgil Abloh launched his brand Off-White. And this was a brand that like the sort of inner fashion community, the very like insular fashion world, was like, we don't understand this guy. Like, he makes sneakers. He makes these really like graphic T-shirts. That's not really like for us. But I sort of, because I wasn't thinking about things in that sort of like, how does this fit into that traditional mold of like, how are we going to sell this on the runway, and how is it a fantasy, and what celebrities are going to wear it. I felt like I was able to catch on to this really interesting person very early on. And in fact, I remember going to a press release or a press conference rather for a sneaker release that he did with Nike, where he'd made, this is like the first kind of big project that he did. He redesigned 10 sort of like iconic Nike shoes. And everyone I worked with at that, like when I was working at the fashion magazine that I was working at the time, was like, why are you going to that? And he gave this incredible, he was such a fascinating talker, and he gave this incredible interview and was like, I really just want to be like the head designer of Celine. And then 8 months later, he became the, menswear designer of Louis Vuitton. And, all of a sudden everyone wanted to like know who this guy was. And I had sort of been following him for a long time. So that was really like, I guess what's interesting, the reason why I sort of tell that story is that, it seems like that is now how the like that sort of instinct that I had at that time, that's how a lot of people have now realized, like, oh, that's such an exciting way to look at clothing and to, to sort of like decode what a designer is doing. In part, it's because like celebrities and stylists and all this kind of media around the fashion industry has like really expanded the narrative of like what a fashion collection is. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's like, there was also a period like right before I started following Virgil Abloh where, I realized like celebrity stylists were becoming super powerful, and I sort of made it a point to like profile each one. And now like celebrity stylists are so powerful that they're like harder to get an interview with than the designers. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I'm so interested in finding these like ways in that are not necessarily sort of the standard way to do things. In fashion, there's like a lot of sort of, there's almost like a checklist of how you do things or how you cover things or think about things. There are so many like cliches and tropes in style writing. Like the word chic is really overused, for example, like uptown meets downtown, like those kinds of things. And I think I was really, and I still am like really interested in how you just not just resist those things, but like avoid them entirely, like just take a different avenue. So yeah, I would say that that's sort of, and now it's funny, like now that I sort of have been doing that for a few years, now I am getting really into doing runway reviews, because I feel like I covered fashion from this other perspective for such a long time that now I feel like I have a kind of way in to the fashion shows that, like intellectually, that allows me to connect it to these much larger things. Like I wrote this review about the Prada show that took place in Milan this morning, and it was about what I wrote about was that she, the designer showed these like enormous coats and like heavy shoulders and like very aggressive and this image of power that I found really imperious and sort of surprising, because if I think about being a woman today, at least in the United States, like we think a lot and talk a lot about vulnerability and being, kind of open and power is bad and power is dangerous and it's always abused. And so I thought, why would this designer be showing this completely, disjunctive image? And, I wrote about it as this kind of like throwing down the gauntlet of saying, okay, but what if we did want to embrace power? Like, what would that look like? Can that be attractive and like feminine and exciting in this moment?
That's great. I mean, I was about to ask you, what you made of it, but then you explained. Well, when did you first find yourself kind of interested in fashion as fashion? Just not just, oh, that's a cool shirt or whatever, but like starting to think about, a world that, that such objects occupied and expressed.
Mm-hmm. Well, there were a couple of writers who really got me interested in it. One was Kathy Horn, who was the longtime fashion critic at the New York Times. The other was Robin Gavin, who was the longtime fashion critic at the Washington Post. And Robin Gavin, what's so amazing about her is that she always wrote about what politicians were wearing. I mean, exactly. I think part of the reason why she was so comfortable doing that is that she was at the Post, so she's in this kind of like political power center. But she wrote this amazing column about this really ugly coat that Dick Cheney wore to the inauguration, I think the second Bush inauguration, and she was like, this is completely disrespectful. You shouldn't be you should be wearing like a black coat. You should look, formal and appropriate, and I just hadn't really thought about I guess I'd always kind of had those opinions, but I didn't realize that someone could have those opinions in a way that was meaningful to discourse about clothing and culture. And so I've just found her writing completely fascinating. So it was really kind of obsessively reading those two writers. And then I remember, really admiring the critical shopper column that the New York Times style section had. And there was one that, and in fact, I remember sitting in the couch of the Kelly Writer's house when I was working on my thesis and bringing this up to you because I was so obsessed with it. But there was a writer named Alex Kaczynski who wrote that column for a long time. And she wrote this review of an Anthropologie store that had just opened at Rockefeller Center. And she wrote about the store, which sells, a lot of kind of cheeky aprons and, kitchen sort of like, measuring spoons that look like giraffes. And it's very sort of quirky and sort of precious. And she wrote about how this store was a place that was, it was developed as a place for women, in their 30s and 40s to shop. And she realized that was the women who were that age would have been the first sort of children of divorce. And that maybe the reason why the store was so appealing to these women is that it was like this possibility of creating this domestic fantasy that they had never had as children, this sort of like blissful, happy kitchen, I'm making a pie. sort of.
Sure,
And
no,
I
absolutely.
thought, oh my God, like this is so cool. Like it says it's about this store, it's about clothing, it's about buying stuff, but she's doing so much with that material, with that evidence, and creating a really compelling sort of portrait of this sort of shopper.
And at what point did you feel like, this was something that you could do? Like when, sort of, I mean, once you got out of here, or maybe even while you were here, what made it seem like, wow, not only can I just read this stuff and enjoy it and learn from it, but I can actually execute it in the world.
Well, I remember it was something that I did, I think my final piece for the first class that I took with you, I wrote about a vintage store in downtown Philadelphia. Yeah. And so it was something that I was already kind of drawn to at that point. But, when I graduated, it was such a funny time for like magazines and websites, because it was still sort of a period where like most magazines had a website, but like they didn't really, like the editors in chief didn't like look at them. I used to work for Vanity Fair, and Graydon has like said this. Graydon Carter, who was the editor at the time, has said this, so I'm not like giving anything away. But it wasn't the dominant discourse that it is now. And it was also really hard to get those kinds of, not well paying, can you make copies of Page Six every morning type of jobs, and then maybe in 5 years we'll let you write like 200 words about a book that you read. It was really hard to get those jobs. And interestingly, when I graduated, there was this boom in personal style blogging, and women were sort of a lot of young women and some young men were starting their own blog where they would take pictures of their outfits. They would review fashion shows. They would talk about like where they were shopping and why. And the writing was really original, and it was so fresh. And again, it was like something that felt like it broke through that very prescribed way of like writing about clothes.
Right.
And so in fact, I started one myself. And I think like I came in at one point and talked about it to your class.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, you certainly did. Yeah.
And it was like in a funny way, it was like more fun to do that, and also an opportunity to like develop like a different way of looking at and talking about clothing in conversation with the other people who were doing this, and not necessarily having an editor who was saying like, well, this is our house voice and this is how we do it. And I'm seeing like a similar thing happening now, where there are so many people, like especially people who are just graduating or about to graduate, or who are starting like fashion Substacks, or starting fashion newsletters or that sort of thing, because it just feels like, it's funny. It's like fashion criticism is like really stylish right now. And you also have these designers who are doing these things that like beg to be analyzed in these ways. Like, Demna Gvasalia, who's the designer at Balenciaga, is creating these kinds of like criticism ready, like analyze me baby sort of fashion collections that make it really compelling to want to say something and weigh in and like develop your own voice, which I think is really cool.
One of the things, thinking about the Bowie class and stuff, is that now, especially with hip hop, I mean, so many artists are, either designing themselves or involved directly with designers. And, could you talk a little bit about that phenomenon and, how that sort of affects what you write about? I mean, you've done some Kanye stuff and.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that I think the fashion industry has like done a lot of work, to recognize how influential like rappers and musicians are on what they do and the popular taste of around clothing. But there's still like so much catching up to do. It's funny, like but if you think about like it's, someone I've been thinking about a lot, who I love, is Tyler, the Creator. And Tyler, the Creator, is doing, I mean, he dresses in this very like preppy skater way. And there's been this huge kind of, in the menswear world, this real interest, this reemergence of preppy clothing. There are all of these like stores in Nolita that essentially make, like button up shirts and, chinos and that sort of thing. But it's something different than J. Crew. And, people are always like, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And it's like, well, Tyler, the Creator, invented this style and everyone wants to dress like Tyler, the Creator. So yeah, I mean, I think, and the other thing that's so great about that is that people may not have heard of a brand like Aimé Leon Dore or Noah, or Rude. Like those might not be like household names, but everyone has heard of Tyler, the Creator, and can look at him and like quickly understand the way that he dresses. And so what's exciting about that is that then that kind of gives you a way in to sort of unpack, why is this happening and why are people dressing this way? And how is Tyler sort of like flexing his influence? The thing that's very fascinating about Kanye in particular is that, he's really, it's hard to sort of wrap your head around, and I don't even know that he has, like, what is his power and influence in the fashion industry? To me, what it is that he seems to point to people or phenomena before anyone else does. So, like, he was the first person to wear Demna. Like, he was, like, no one was wearing that before him. There were a few people who were like, why are there these really giant, weird, oversized sweatshirts? And I guess Lord is wearing one. But he was really, like, the first person to say, this Georgian designer who like no one else is paying attention to is like the future of fashion, and now he actually really is. He very controversially has given Kim Kardashian a number of makeovers, but it is interesting to consider that when he began dressing her in away from her kind of like party girl wardrobe and in these more like sleek shapes by the designer Phoebe Philo, who was then at Celine, that had actually this huge outsized impact on the way women dressed. Like, women still dress like that now, even though Phoebe Philo hasn't been designing at this brand for almost 5 years. So yeah, I mean, that's the really great thing about musicians who have this like really passionate an innate relationship to fashion, is that it just like gives everyone a way in, I think,
the one of the points that you made in the Bowie class upstairs is, you were saying about how Bowie used like his actual body as a kind of fashion piece, and that and as part of his art, not just I'm wearing this cool jacket or I have a cool tattoo or something, but, really just almost like reinventing his physical self. I wonder if you could talk, are there other artists, or musicians or, even actors or anyone that, you would say that about, these days?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that, one of the sort of dominating discussions in the fashion industry right now is the body positivity movement and this sort of growing backlash that is happening. Like if you, I was looking at, I didn't go to London for Women's Fashion Week, but I was looking at all of the pictures, and there's this fantastic model. Like, I think she's probably the best model working right now, sort of indisputably, named Paloma Elsesser, who is a plus size model. And she was almost the only plus size model in any of the shows, which, a lot of, if you read anything about these shows, like what's sort of published, the sort of media discourse is like, this is so great, but behind the scenes, I think everyone is like, why is there just one model? And she's also like the most famous, she's like one of the 5 most famous models working right now. So it's not like you made a chic discovery here or something. But you worry about with someone like that, whether, are we putting too much pressure on this person to like constantly explain these issues, which is something that happens a lot in fashion. It's a place that has, or it's an industry that has like really sort of, there's a lot of tokenism, and there's a lot of reliance on people to sort of explain themselves constantly. The cool thing about Paloma is that she recently did this cover of ID magazine, and she was wearing this look from a brand called Miu Miu, which is the sort of like little sister brand of Prada. And that show was another show where people were sort of behind the scenes like, wow, it seems like we had moved towards this, very body positive, like acceptance, sort of diverse forms on the runway. And now there's like something brewing in reaction to that, because the models were so thin. And the silhouettes were like mini skirts and chopped off tops. So you had this really the sort of the presentation of the show was just like these long abdomened people just like coming at you. And on this cover of ID that came out this past week, Paloma was wearing this, mini skirt that's like, it looks like a teenage girl took scissors and just cut off the mini skirt. She was like, I don't want to wear this uniform. And then the same with this sweater. And people were really excited that, a plus size model was styled in this look. But what I found interesting about it is that like I was like, wow, she actually like interpreted it in a way that like I actually understood the clothing better than I did in the runway setting.
Wow, how come?
Well, because it felt, she looked so like sexy and cool, and she was kind of like snarling at the camera, and so that's when it suddenly clicked, like, oh, this is like a girl who's like, I'm tired of this long skirt, and like chopped it, took scissors and like really cut it off. And you could, she really like embodied the clothing in a way that I hadn't seen someone else do.
I just want to say, I'm going to ask Rachel another question, and then we'd love to open the floor to your own inquiries and comments, observations. I don't know, this might be sort of lame, but what what do you see as trends? Like, what is your sense of where things are going, or is that too like vague or ridiculous?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like there was a long period of time where fashion existed to offer these like dictates that everyone followed. Like there, for a long time it was like hemlines. Like all these people would go to Paris and they would come back and write in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, like the hemline has gone up 2 inches, like it's down 1 inch. And that sort of thing like certainly doesn't happen anymore. I think personal style and like self-expression seems to be the thing that everyone cares about. It's certainly like what I care about. And again, it's like that is more interesting to me than just considering like what was the designer's intention and, how did they present it on the runway and what was the music? Like that's really interesting. But as soon as someone else wears it or buys it, that narrative is like irrelevant and out the window, which is part of what I think is so interesting about fashion. Like the sort of artist's intention ultimately may not even matter, and can become irrelevant or obsolete so quickly. So I think that's, this sense of like this kind of exploration of like, what are people doing with their clothes, and like, how are they styling them, and where are they buying clothes, and how are they buying them? Especially as like younger people are more concerned about, is the clothing sustainable? Like, how is it made? And, the fashion industry doesn't have a great reputation when it comes to contributing to climate change. So, I think that trying to think like more conscientiously, but also, again, this kind of like declarative creation of identities and like exploration of the self, that feels like a huge thing in fashion right now.
Great. Well, why don't we open the floor to questions? You know, anybody have one? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name's Judy. I'm a senior. I actually interned at Prada last summer, so I really liked what you said about Prada in the show this morning.
Okay.
And I just want to first ask, where's your jacket from?
I was going to ask that.
So I found this at this vintage market that happens in Brooklyn, like throughout the fall, every couple of weeks in Industry City. And it was just at like us in a tent, like, that little like different vintage dealers have these like stalls, and the label inside says Jumpin' Jack Flash, which I then, when I got home, I looked it up, and it was like a glam rock store that existed in New York and London in the 70s and very early 80s. And it sold reproductions of like costumes that like Kiss and David Bowie wore. So, yeah.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
So I guess I won't be finding that brand anytime soon. But I wanted to ask, since major luxury brands, the fashion shows, as well as the focus on red carpets have sort of been dissipating, and we see that as a trend. COVID has been like the catalyst for that, but honestly, maybe that's sort of been happening for a while. And as a fashion critic, how do you see that change your industry's focus of like writing? Because obviously it used to be so happening around like this person wore that on this particular red carpet, but now it's changed so much. And how does your industry navigate that change?
I think that's such a fantastic question, because that was really, the red carpet was really like basically the runway for most of the world. Like, people in the fashion industry would see a dress and react to it. But then maybe 4 months later, an actor would wear it on the Oscars red carpet, and the rest of the world was then being introduced to it, even though, there were images on Vogue runway and maybe it appeared in magazines and stuff before then. I do think that, street style and the way that models, like, especially like Bella Hadid, for example, approach street style and have like stylists dedicated to putting together looks for them to wear, like when they leave their apartment. Like, that is something that is increasingly like taking the place of that sort of conversation. Also, I was so wowed by Rihanna's pregnancy reveal photos. She hired a sort of like a super creative paparazzo, essentially, to photograph images of her and A$AP Rocky walking in Harlem. And they were both wearing like incredible outfits. And, she was wearing a vintage Chanel jacket from the 1990s, and a pair of jeans by Vetements, which is the brand that Demna started, that Kanye was such a big fan of. And, it was clear that she was making that into a fashion moment. And she's, it's amazing. She is like, all of the outfits that she's been wearing are bearing her belly. Which it's so fabulous, and it's really beautiful. And often she's like draped in chains as well. Like, she'll have like these beautiful kind of chains draped over her belly. And that to me feels more exciting, and also it seems more organic. It feels like she's making styling choices that reflect something that's happening in her life. And there's a kind of narrative that she's creating with the clothes. And that is more, I think, compelling to the world now than like the super hyper stylized behind the scenes dealings of like an Oscar dress. It feels more relatable and more human.
Anyone else? Oh, come on. I know you all. Well, there we are.
Hi, my name's Kendall. I just wanted to ask, well, first of all, I also wanted to comment on your lovely jacket and how appropriate it is that you are talking about fashion while being so fashionable. But I wanted to ask because fashion is such like a visual field that I almost feel like fashion writing is kind of an oxymoron.
Yeah.
And so you didn't really talk about like the actual like writing aspect of fashion. So I just wanted to know how you approach kind of integrating the two different mediums there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's such a great. I'm so glad you asked that, because I remember like when I first started trying to write like fashion criticism, I would realize that I had just written like 600 words like poetically describing like jackets and stuff, but I hadn't actually like said anything. And so really what it is, you know, every fashion is really visual, but everyone has a reaction to it, right? Like, and for everyone that reaction is different. There are some things that are sort of like shared feelings about what a garment might represent, especially if it's like a uniform or something super like a style sort of cliche, like, right, like a strapless gown with a big skirt, right? We all kind of think, okay, 1950s, like a classic like awards show glamour sort of thing. So I think it's about both identifying what those sorts of reactions might be in a shared way, and then integrating as well my own sort of particular feelings about that, you know? So like this, we'll go back to like this Prada show. There were all of these jackets with like enormous shoulders, and I think, you know, and these kind of nipped in waists, but like really big bulky jackets. And I think basically, you know, pretty much I'm sort of like, okay, most of us would look at that and think, wow, that looks really like powerful. You know, big shoulders, like even if we're not consciously thinking that, that's sort of what we like associate it with. And then it's sort of like pushing that further, like, okay, well, why would the designer have made that choice? And trying to think out like, you know, why would they do that? How did they do it? You know, is there something that's sort of in the jacket itself that is creating that mood? You know, some of the jackets had these like big crazy like fur sort of like almost biceps on them. And so again, you know, maybe like most people wouldn't look at the jacket and say that's a fur bicep, but you begin to sort of like, okay, there's like every photo I'm looking at from this show is drawing attention to here, and like what happens here, right? Like you lift things up, like sort of strength emanates from the shoulders and the upper arms. And so, you know, and in some ways that's also, I guess, kind of how like a designer thinks, right? Like you get an idea and you get sort of carried away with it, which is, I think, like what happens, at least when I'm writing about fashion.
You know, I think, I mean, that is an interesting question. And I think about it, you know, on a number of occasions, I've been asked to write text for photo books, and, you know, and done some writing for TV. And, you know, one of the things that people said was just, well, the thing is right in front of them. You know, like they can see it. You know, what are you going to say? Well, I feel, I mean, I myself as a reader, you know, I like to sort of understand what I'm looking at, you know, even if it's something I know a lot about, you know, a smart person writing about it, and even just simply describing it. It's like, oh, right. Like I kind of, you know, we were talking about some of these images of David Bowie today, you know, a lot of the remarks that you made and even the class made, you know, was just like, oh, wow, you know, yeah, I didn't really think about how that looked. And so I think that, you know, the ability of language to provide depth and context to what's visual is very important, you know, and I think that's, you know, one of the reasons why, you know, it's like, you know, when people would say, like, how do you write about music? Or, you know, how do you write about, you know, just anything that is dance. Like I used to, you know, I'm not, you know, a particular, you know, I mean, I can dance. I can hold my own on the dance floor, but I'm not, you know, I mean, you know, a sort of ballet person or something. But I used to, you know, and still do, like to read dance criticism, because those people have to kind of invent a language, you know, to describe what they're seeing. And, you know, often, you know, they have to evoke these kind of movements that if you weren't there, like, how are you supposed to get an image of that in your mind? Well, that's their job, and then of course to analyze it. And so I feel like it's almost like the best kind of writing, or the most fun kind of writing to do, is to get a chance to to express yourself that way, and not be daunted by it, but like take it as a sort of opportunity, or as a even inspiration, to create a language that somehow suits, or adds something to what people are actually looking at.
Hi, I'm Madeline. Nice to meet you. I had a question about how I really liked how you commented about how fashion and what the fashion world is looking at right now is definitely more off the runway, and you kind of expanded it to singers and artists, and the world, I guess, of what is available to critique on is much bigger now. So I was wondering, in your process, how do you figure out what is worth critiquing, or what would be interesting to critique? Is that something that is more of just a creative direction, that everybody kind of has their own language or things that spark their eye, or are there certain rules or guidelines that you go by that kind of make you realize, okay, this is something that I could comment on that would be fun critiquing?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great question. Like, I feel like I could, like, honestly, like, I could write like Daily Mail captions. Like, I would, I'm sort of like happy to comment on everything, especially because, everyone's image is so constructed now. Like, everyone has like a personal stylist. And what, living in New York, walking around, you can really see that, like, a lot of young people, like people my age and younger, are like thinking of themselves as like, I'm my own personal stylist. Like, there's just this like extreme construction of the self that is constantly happening. But I do think if it's, something that feels like new or unexpected, that's like always worth writing about. I noticed like a few months ago that, this sort of young son of the head of LVMH is this guy Bernard Arnault, who's he's like, at any given time, he's like either the first or the third richest guy in the world. And his son, who is, I believe, 30, is now like the head of communications at Tiffany. And I noticed that, okay, like he's like hanging out with JayZ in the Hamptons, and then he buys JayZ's champagne company. And then he gets JayZ to star in a Tiffany's ad. Like, there's something interesting going on there. Like, JayZ is really like working this friendship to his benefit. And like something like that, as I'm like, okay, like this is kind of like inner workings of the fashion industry stuff. But you also have this narrative of this like young 30-something guy who's like, oh my God, I actually get to hang out with JayZ. And like, what is sort of happening in that relationship there, So that's like an example of something that I remember sort of following that. And then when he appeared in when JayZ and Beyonce appeared in that Tiffany's ad, I was like, okay, I have to unpack this. Sometimes it's about like sort of filing things away too, and like waiting for that narrative to build.
Well, you have instincts. I mean, your editorial instincts are very good. I think that's one, I mean, I feel like, writers occasionally, sort of go through these periods, and, some last longer in this regard than others. But, I think like you're in this mode where like you get it, you sort of get it. Like when I read you, that's what I feel. Like, oh, okay, she understands this, which even reading certain smart people, you don't feel that way about. But like, you've somehow managed to bring yourself to this point where it's just kind of like what you're looking at and what you think about it is kind of important for people to know. I mean, I don't expect you necessarily to agree with that, but I mean, I do feel that, I genuinely believe that about you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think it's also thinking about like different kinds of readers and like what they would look at and be like, that's kind of weird. Like, what's going on there? Like, why is JayZ hanging out with this nerdy 30-year-old in the Hamptons when he could, or like Jack Dorsey, he could hang out with anyone. So I think it's, trying to look at things and think about, looking at things and thinking about like, who would find this curious or like inscrutable or, and trying to answer and explain that.
One interesting thing, I mean, just not to get, go off in a JayZ direction, but I mean, I was writing a profile of him one time, and I forget where this guy worked, although it was some huge corporation that JayZ had made some deal with. And, he was supposed to be a secondary in the story. And, secondaries often, as you know, like, don't really have much to add to the picture. I mean, but this guy was good. And he said, what's really interesting about JayZ is kind of JayZ wants everybody to win. Like, if JayZ comes to the meeting, it goes, look, we have meetings with rock stars and rappers and everybody all the time. And, 99% of the time, those people walk in the room and say, okay, what are you going to do for me? And, yeah, I can maybe do something for you if I'm in the mood to. Because whereas JayZ, like, really wants to have a conversation. Like, how do we all make this work for us? How does it work for me? And it works for you. We all make money. We're all happy. We do the stuff we want to do. And, I sort of feel like as you were describing that, I found myself thinking about that. Like, it's not, he sees something there for him. And, the Tiffany guy obviously gets, that ad was gigantic, and it really positioned, Tiffany in a way that I'm sure, they want to be positioned, So, anyway, fascinating. Anyone else? Yeah. Go ahead. The person in the green sweater.
Hi, I'm Emily. Thank you so much for coming. And after you spoke a little bit about your jacket, I actually had a question just more broadly about how you think that a rise in interest in like vintage fashion is affecting your job. Do you find yourself like explaining the history of pieces more often or covering fashion in a different way, given that a lot of the stuff that people are interested in is now like decades old and maybe more one of a kind?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about writing about fashion. I mean, I suppose this is true of anything, of covering anything, but I just kind of like follow what people are interested in, so yeah, like when people started getting really into archival fashion, it was like, well, maybe this is just like more interesting than what like the new things that people are making. But yeah, I mean, there's so much. It's such a great example of why fashion is so fun to cover, because it's a sustainability issue, right? It's like a like sort of collector, like super fan thing. And then also it's affecting the way that clothing is made and produced. Like there was a Fendi show yesterday in Milan, and the designer referenced, like he saw the owner, he saw the sort of Fendi heiress walk in this blouse that was her mother's from 1983, and he was like, let's make the whole collection about that. Which is something, fashion designers have always done things like that, but it's, now I think most designers, whether they're kind of very old school, like the Fendi designer Kim Jones is like pretty old school in some ways, or like super hyper contemporary and modern, like this designer Glenn Martins is an example. Like, you have to be in conversation with what people are buying and looking at. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of critics are frustrated that maybe the sort of chase for archival vintage is squelching their own business. I think a lot of also like young people who are super interested in fashion are like, well, you should be making things that we'll want to have collected in 10 years, and you're not doing that in many cases. It's not always true. I mean, there's like a designer like Demna, who is at Balenciaga, is making things that like should go in a museum now. But yeah, it's kind of a classic example of the market or the customer having like a new kind of upper hand, which is always really exciting. Yeah.
Why don't we didn't take your question before, so why don't we just take it now? And this, I think, will be the last one for the day.
Yeah, so I'm Ryan. Thank you very much again for coming in. I was, we've been talking a lot about Bowie, but I've also just been kind of, he's been kind of doing a lot of breaking gender norms with his fashion since the 70s, but I feel like we've lately been seeing a lot of like an increase in like gender fluidity, especially with like Billy Porter, Harry Styles. But I was wondering kind of with this rise in that, for so long, fashion, I feel, has been gendered with like men's and women's coverage and kind of like even separation of shows. How has this sort of increase in like gender fluidity affected the way that you've been able to have to like coverage or critique? Has it made it easier because like you're able to then like talk about garments more objective, or is there like an added sense of complexity kind of thinking about when like you have a men's show that it's like them all donned in cat suits and such like that?
Yeah. That's a great question. So as Anthony mentioned, my previous job was at GQ. And so this is something that we thought about and talked about obsessively. We did an issue in 2019 called the New Masculinity issue. And we thought about and planned this issue for months and months and months. And I remember we felt like we were being extraordinarily bold by putting Pharrell in basically a gown on the cover of the magazine. That felt really like bold in 2019. And like right before the pandemic, like early 2020, I was sort of wondering to myself, like who's going to be the first guy to wear a skirt to the office? And then like 6 months into the pandemic, it was like everyone was wearing skirts. It was like no big deal. So there was this interesting like acceleration that I think happened in part because of, people like Billy Porter and Harry Styles. And then also like, this kind of rabid interest online with like looking at old paparazzi photos and like old kind of, there are these amazing like self-taught fashion archivists on Instagram and on Twitter who are like constantly surfacing these images and these are like people who are like 22 years old and they're just like doing this in their bedroom, like for fun. And like bringing up images of Dennis Rodman and saying like, hey, like this guy was doing it in the 1990s. And so I think, the acceleration of like image sharing and also this kind of like explosion of personal style that we were talking about has made all of those sort of questions about like, ooh, is this okay? Or is that bold? Or is that provocative feel like kind of like silly? And so, yeah, I mean, it is funny. Like when we were talking about Bowie, it was like, yeah, like that was really that. I think like that made people sort of uncomfortable and upset that he was playing with the, with the ambiguity and like proclaiming himself as a bisexual. Whereas now that's like what you put in your social media profile.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it was interesting too. You raised one thing I like about you also is like, you're not afraid to raise like very basic questions. Like when you're talking about shock, when we were talking about, in the Bowie class, just what is the value of shock? Mm-hmm. Like what, because other people are saying, oh, that's just shock value. Okay. So is that good? Is that bad? Is it fun? Is it interesting? Does it say something? I think those are really interesting questions. And that, I mean, that's kind of a little bit of what you're getting at here. Like, shock can play a function. But once it happens, I mean, then it doesn't shock anymore. Mm-hmm. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for being here this evening. I really sort of like, I'm very reluctant to do this kind of thing, but I was saying to Rachel, beforehand, I was always like a little bit struck. I teach this arts and popular culture class, and I always thought that like, kids who are interested in fashion, that it would be a good place for them. and I think it is. And so, you know, if any of you are inclined to show up there, please do. I teach it in the fall, and you know, you'd get certainly an opportunity to write about fashion and, you know, whatever else, you know, is of interest to you. And once again, I mean, you know, Rachel did a you know, great duty today. Again, just doing a spectacular job in the Bowie class, and then down here. So thank you again.
Thanks
It's really
for
a
having
pleasure
me.
to see you.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, all
Thanks.
of you, for coming. Okay. Bye bye. Yeah, I got it. You're killing it.